Okay, I would like to start my presentation. The title of my presentation today is Sino-Japanese Children Born During and After the Second Sino-Japanese War, Identity and Belonging of Children Who Returned to Japan. I would like to start this presentation with some explanation on who those children born of war are. This term has not been used often in the East Asian context, but children born of war is a growing interdisciplinary research field. Some of the earlier, most prominent studies in this field focus on children born of German soldiers and local women in German-occupied territories during World War II. Intimate relationships between foreign military personnel and local women in wars and conflicts range from rape and sexual slavery to loving relationships and friendly business arrangements. Many children born of war strongly wish to know who their father was, but in many cases, no one wished to talk about him. And it has been said that this is caused by the taboo within and outside the family around the subject of how these children were conceived. Various groups of children born of war also share a variety of adverse experiences, such as stigmatization and discrimination for having an enemy father. Under such difficult circumstances, they are left to ask themselves the question of their identity and belonging. The issue of the absent father has been identified as the core issue for children born of war's identity and belonging. And interestingly, the previous studies found out that these children are much more likely to idealize rather than demonize the absent father and have a strong desire to search for the father as they see the absent father as the missing piece of the puzzle. So what about children born of the Second Sino-Japanese War? When I embarked on this research project, I quickly found out that there was no official investigation or study on this group of individuals. There is no established term or an association of their own. In China and Japan, the topic of Sino-Japanese children is not even a taboo because it has literally been a non-issue. However, what the previous studies on children born of war point out is that children born of war are not an exceptional phenomenon limited to particular historical and geographical contexts, but children born of war are global phenomenon of conflict. So the starting point of this research was not to ask, do they exist? But was to ask, they must exist. So how can I locate them? And why are they socially invisible? As well as how do their experiences compare to those of other children born of war from other historical and geographical contexts? In the context of the Second Sino-Japanese War, there is a well-studied group of war-affected children who are relevant for Sino-Japanese children in this study. They are stranded war orphans who were left behind in Northeast China after the Soviet army entered the war in August 1945. These stranded war orphans were born of Japanese parentage, and they were often adopted by local Chinese families. The Japanese government has thus far recognized around 3,000 of them as stranded war orphans. When these stranded war orphans started to search for their Japanese kin and returned to Japan in the 1980s, they were supported by thousands of Japanese activists and volunteers. These activists and volunteers for the stranded war orphans turned out to be the key in searching for documents as well as interviewees for this study. Various documents and visual materials provided important but fragmented pieces of information. But 20 files of unpublished personal documents that I could obtain from a law firm in Tokyo contained a wealth of information, And the lawyer who kept these documents was one of the activists who supported the repatriation of the stranded war orphans. Some newspaper articles published in the 1980s reported that Japan's Ministry of Welfare stated that at least 2,000 Sino-Japanese children fathered by Japanese resided in China at that time. Because of the lack of association of Sino-Japanese children, it was extremely time-consuming to search for participants. I've sent letters to about 120 support groups for stranded war orphans across Japan, and I could eventually find 5 participants born of consensual relationships through these associations. 3 other participants were found through other means. 5 participants were born during the war, while 3 were born after the war. As for the place of birth, they were born mostly in large cities in China. It is also important to note that all 28 Sino-Japanese children in this study, including the interviewees and those whose information was found in legal documents, were born of marriage. Their parents' marriage lasted 4 years on average. In the context of the Second Sino-Japanese War, many local women had intimate relationships with Japanese male civilians. Since Sino-Japanese children in this study were mostly fathered by civilians and ununiformed military personnel, they do not fit neatly into the current academic definition of the term children born of war that was developed in the context of wars and conflicts in Europe and Africa. However, a comparative analysis with children born of war from different historical and geographical contexts turned out to be meaningful, especially in terms of the significance of the absent father in the experiences, identity, and belonging of the children. I have also searched for children born of rape and sexual violence committed by Japanese men during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And thus far, there is only one man who had come forward as a child born of a so-called comfort woman in Guangxi. As there was substantial information about his life experiences that were already available, I made a conscious choice not to interview him and focused my analysis on the Sino-Japanese children born of consensual relationships. The previous studies on children born of war have shown that the nature of the parents' relationships has been a poor indicator of the hardships suffered by the children. And therefore, based on such awareness and the limited sources, this study focused on Sino-Japanese children born of consensual relationships and marriage. Because the collected sources and interview materials are mostly from those who migrated to Japan after the re-establishment of the Sino-Japanese relations in 1972, this study focuses on individuals who migrated to Japan. These Sino-Japanese children could settle in Japan because they acquired Japanese nationality based on the former Japanese nationality law that adopted patrilineal jus sanguinis principle, in which nationality could only be passed on from the father to the child. As for the context in which wartime Sino-Japanese consensual relationships and marriage occurred, neither Imperial Japan nor the Chinese government implemented concrete measures to prevent or to promote marriage between Japanese and Chinese during the war. Before moving on to the actual Sino-Japanese intimate relationships and consequent childbirth, I would like to very briefly touch upon the policies towards these Sino-Japanese children and their fathers. In post-war China, many Japanese fathers were first put into repatriation camps and were repatriated without being able to take their Chinese wives and children. After 1972, the issue of the Japanese stranded war orphans received national media attention in Japan. Sino-Japanese children in this study heard about stranded war orphans searching for their Japanese kin, and they also started to send letters to Japan's Ministry of Welfare to search for their fathers and to acquire Japanese nationality. The Japanese Ministry of Welfare has been reluctant in conducting investigation because they did not want to open a Pandora's box of the issues related to children fathered by Japanese across the Asia-Pacific region. Some parents of Sino-Japanese children in this study had loving relationships. They fell in love, they had a wedding party, had children, and simply wanted to continue their family life. They made every effort to be reunited after the father's repatriation. Some never remarried after their separation, as they had hopes to be reunited one day. Other Sino-Japanese couples had more nuanced and complex relationships. When some Chinese women found out that the Japanese partner was already married to a Japanese woman in Japan, their choices were significantly constrained by the fact that they were already pregnant or had given birth to a child of the Japanese partner. Presumably, it would have been much worse financially and socially to be an unwed mother, and they had little choice but to become a second wife. Because of the patriarchal structures and practices in both China and Japan, the Japanese father was placed as the central figure of the household. Some mothers encountered significant adversities in post-war China as they were labeled as traitors. However, the Chinese mothers in this study continued to give their absent Japanese husband a central place in the family. These mothers tried to ensure that the physically absent father remained present in the family. Most mothers openly talked about the father to the child in their intimate sphere. Consequently, all participants had knowledge of good qualities and deeds of the father. Let us now look at these children's experiences, identity, and belonging to find out how and why they migrated to the father's country. All Sino-Japanese children lived through a series of political campaigns in China under Mao, and they tried to hide their biological origin and stay discreet as much as they could. However, the origin of most of these children was known or revealed to the public at some point in their lives, and they suffered from stigmatization and discrimination. They commonly received discriminatory remarks. As a result of these acts of othering, it was difficult for them to engender a sense of belonging to China. Sino-Japanese children also encountered adversities such as barriers to various life opportunities. Some of them were subjected to extremely harsh persecution and experienced several years of detention, imprisonment, and forced labor as for having a Japanese father. Sino-Japanese children actively constructed positive images of the father while they lived in China. Most of them could build positive images of the father through the stories about the father they heard from their mother, relatives, or neighbors. But some were tormented by the father's wartime role. But these children eventually constructed humanized and acceptable notions of the father by omitting inconvenient truth and inconsistencies, and by ignoring negative portrayals of Japanese men in the media and textbooks. Interestingly, all Sino-Japanese children who migrated to Japan in this study called their migration to Japan as return to their homeland in their interviews. But why? First, their sense of national belonging was affected by the logic of patrilineality. When they found out about their father's nationality, they started to consider their homeland as Japan. Also, in the face of various adversities as children born of Japanese fathers, they came to idealize the father's country as a safe haven. One participant wrote in his autobiography that I used to go to sleep and dream about my whole family returned to and reunited in my homeland. While dreaming, I could escape from my sufferings and felt a momentary sense of happiness. Idealized notions of the father and the homeland, as well as their desire to search for and reunite with the absent father, were a significant part of their motivation to migrate to the paternal country. But they also had a strong desire to lift themselves out of dire poverty. Another key motivation was to escape from continuing political vulnerability and the constant state of fear. All economic, political, and emotional factors were inextricably intertwined in their motivation to migrate to Japan, and the degree of importance of each factor weighed differently for each participant. But the significance of the emotional factor tended to be pronounced in their decision to migrate. For instance, an important motive for one participant to live in Japan was to fulfill her filial responsibility to build her father's grave in Japan and bury the ashes of her father, who died in post-war China. After Sino-Japanese children had finally migrated to Japan, they encountered various challenges. One participant maintained a clear sense of belonging to Japan, and yet she stated that she feels in between because of the way she has been treated in both countries. Two participants have published their books based on their experiences, and they developed what could be called as bridge builder identity. They feel that they are in a unique position to discuss the war and peace between Japan and China, not just because they were born of love during the war, but also because they have witnessed both in humanity and inhumanity in their maternal and paternal countries. What stood out in their narratives was that their constructed notion of the absent father remains to be extremely important in constructing their identity and belonging even in their old age. Positivity that stood out in participants' narratives could be explained by a number of factors. First, they felt relatively fortunate by comparing themselves with other groups of people who suffered more or passed away in post-war political campaigns in China. Secondly, they successfully achieved their major life goals, namely their search for the father and their return to their homeland. Thirdly, Sino-Japanese children in this study could obtain substantial information about the father, which served as a basis to selectively recollect the positive aspects of the father and construct ideal or acceptable notions of the father. Such positive construction of the father seemed to have helped them greatly in constructing their personal identity positively. Lastly, because they have remained scattered and socially invisible, the participants were never involved in identity politics. They received little recognition from the government and public, but in turn, they could construct their narratives relatively freely without constraints of being part of a group with common identity as war victims. While Sino-Japanese children have been missing from the war memories in China and Japan, their life stories provide powerful evidence of far-reaching consequences of the war, as well as transnational familial love in Sino-Japanese human interactions. I believe this study can provide initial insights into experiences, identity, and belonging of these Sino-Japanese children born of consensual relationships, especially on the lifelong significance of the constructed notions of the long-lost father in their identity, belonging, and life choices. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I would like to introduce Akino, who is our next presenter. Akino Oshiro is a PhD candidate in Japanology at Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nuremberg, sorry for my pronunciation, in Germany. After she received her master's degree in sociology from University of Hawaii at Manoa, she now works on her dissertation research focusing on the experiences of local workers on US military base during the US occupation period of Okinawa. Her research is part of the group project called Re-Education Revisited, in which they pay attention to various places where US occupation took place, such as Japan, Germany, and Okinawa, and examine how US re-education influenced race, ethnicity, gender, political culture, and more of aforementioned places. So the title of her presentation today is Making Workers in Post-War Okinawa, Economic Reform Policies by the US, Japan, and Okinawa, and Subjectivity of Workers, 1945 to 1972. So the floor is yours, Akino.
Thank you so much, Kanako-san, for the great introduction. Let me share my screen. Is this working now?
Yes.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Akino Oshiro. I am a PhD student majoring in Japanese studies at FAU. First of all, thank you so much for organizers and the moderators for this panel, and then thank you everyone here joining today. I'm going to give a presentation on my PhD research that I'm currently working on. My research tries to revisit and decolonize the idea of development of Okinawa. And then I try to put emphasis on the relationship between development and the existence of US military bases that station in Okinawa. My specific focus is the participation of the local Okinawans in US military activities known as military base work. To give you a little background of the topic, my research focuses on the history of Okinawa. It is well recognized today that Okinawa is under Japan's jurisdiction, and it is one of the 47 prefectures of the country. But I also want to emphasize that Okinawa once existed as an independent kingdom in the past, known as Ryukyu Kingdom, with its own language, culture, and a history until Japan took over its sovereignty in 1879. Fast forward to 20th century, in 1945, Okinawa became the only site of grand battlefield of World War II. As a result, 1/4 of the island's population was killed, and then almost 90% of homes and the buildings were completely destroyed. After that, occupation by the US military was declared, and then the US occupation continued for 27 years. The US Cold War strategy made Okinawa as a keystone of the Pacific, and then islands were heavily fortified by the US forces. In 1972, which is only about 50 years from today, Okinawa was again incorporated back into Japan's jurisdiction. As of today, Okinawa still bears almost 70% of the whole US military installations in Japan. The time period that my research specifically focuses on is this 27 years of the US occupation of Okinawa. This particular period is one of the most important times in Okinawa modern history because it is generally agreed by scholars that this is the period that modernization and industrialization were accelerated, and it was at the peak of post-war Okinawa development. Notwithstanding that the Battle of Okinawa destroyed the vast majority of social structure and a social relation, Okinawa experienced the reconstruction and a redevelopment at a great speed. And then people's living standard returned back to the level of pre-war only in the 8 years since the end of war. And the Okinawa transformed from an agriculture-oriented society to a service industry-oriented society. Referring to this condition, it is understandable that scholars argue that modernization and industrialization in Okinawa were accelerated and reached to its peak during the US occupation period. However, this structural change is not uncommon at that time, and it can be found as a general post-war development in other parts of Japan. However, looking at the details more closely, post-war Okinawa experienced a unique development that is distinctive from the mainland Japan. That is, the economy in post-war Okinawa developed intricately intertwining with the US military base presence. As a result, there's a new type of work emerged in post-war Okinawa, which I want to pay attention in this research, which is known as military-based work. Not only it was a new type of work, but the level of social influence was not too small to ignore that 15% of the entire employed population had become employees of the US military by 1950. Moreover, why it is important to revisit the history of development now is that I argue that the legacy of colonial development is still persistent and it is still probable in Okinawa, which makes the situation distinctive from the mainland Japan. A recent report on the industrial structure of Okinawa Prefecture states that ratio of third industry is much larger than that of the national average, and the second industry is much smaller compared to that of the nation. Especially looking only at the manufacturing industry, it is strangely smaller in Okinawa than the national average. Therefore, I argue that there is necessity of prioritizing the post-colonial point of view to revisit the idea of development in Okinawan society, Okinawan history. In this research, I want to examine so-called development in post-war Okinawa from a different angle. I am interested in finding out what is the meaning of emergence of this new kind of work, so-called military-based work and modernization of post-war Okinawa. How did military-based work play a role in development? Methodologically speaking, my main resources is archival materials, such as government official documents, personal documents, newspaper articles, magazine articles, and personal memoirs. My argument that there is necessity of prioritizing the post-colonial point of view is inspired by scholarship focusing on other cases of US military bases where mobilizing local population for their operation. Those scholars argue that it allows us to look at the US empire through the lens of labor history. For example, Jackson asserts an importance of mapping a global network of this condition as he compares and connects 5 sites where US military interventions and occupations took place. And he points out that infrastructure development, which was led by the US, but completed by local civilians, resulted in the state centralization and in capital accumulation for US to make a global technology of imperial power. It is not merely a historical event where US military mobilized non-US civilians for their operation, as the present-day US military empire is profoundly dependent upon a global army of labor, as Moore argues. Following their analytical point of view, I argue that re-examining history and an experience of civilian workers in US military activities not only allows us to illuminate the intersection of US colonialism, imperialism, racism, capitalism, but it also helps us to revisit the working class history from a post-colonial point of view. So what is military-based work? The military-based work in this context of this paper refers to the civilian work functioning to support the installations and activities of the US military. It is a broad concept of any work related to operating the US military installations, the local population in Okinawa engaged. This is just an example of military-based work in Okinawa, which was collected and organized by a local historian, Professor Ishihara. So first, I paid attention to the condition of how military-based worker emerged in the first place. By tracing the historical records, we can see that the work done by civilians for the US military activities started already during the World War II. In 1945, survived but captured Okinawans were interned in camps on the island. There, those at the camps were mobilized to work for the US military. They worked to distribute rations, which was provided from the US. They did farming jobs. They did administration jobs at the camps, and so on. They also took care of cleaning bathrooms and then drains at the camps. They did not receive any salary for the work they do. Instead, they received rations. If workers did not arrive on time or they neglected their duties, their rations were confiscated by the US. In this way, US military disciplined and controlled civilians through work in the military labor force. Civilians often had no choice but to be engaged in military work in order to get access to the food. They were also recruited to take care of dead bodies and retrieve the belongings of those who were killed during the war. One war survivor testifies that these jobs were life-threatening to them because it was still during the war, and they were live bullets fired between US and Japan forces above those workers' head. Early civilian recruitment for US military work involved labor that was predicated upon people's lives in many ways. Civilians were kept alive by having to clean the dead bodies of their fellow Okinawans, whose deaths were caused by the US and Japanese militaries. Ultimately, the labor that civilians provided while jeopardizing their lives profited US military expansion, which yet further dispossessed civilians of their means of production. Second, I paid attention to the time when the number of military-based workers increased. To secure and increase the sufficient labor force for expansion of US military facilities in Okinawa, in order to prepare for Asian Cold War politics, the US administration needed to employ a new strategy to mobilize the local population for work. They therefore decided in 1950 to increase the salary to about 3 times of the previous amount. As the US had hoped 7 to 8 times more job applications were submitted than the number of jobs offered just in 3 days. As a result, more people left in Okinawa their agricultural work, and many of them transferred to either construction work or work at the military installations. Following its salary increases, the US military government succeeded in mobilizing more people and convincing farmers to switch to military-related work. While this policy provided financial stability for local workers, it also helped the US to secure a labor force for the expansion and consolidation of their military presence on the island. It can be argued that the US-led economic recovery policy in Okinawa functioned as a means of disciplining civilian local Okinawans and gaining their acceptance of the US occupation. At the same time, it enabled US military expansion along with simultaneously reinforcing their global imperialistic ideology. Interestingly, the US administration advertised their effort of recruiting local citizens for military-based work as an American philanthropic activity that realized much needed progress and an advancement in post-war Okinawa. Referring to Shurei no Hikari, this magazine shown here, a magazine published by US military administration for Okinawan locals, constantly portray the US economic activity in a way that they're providing employment opportunities and economic advancement to the local citizens. In these articles, they use the rhetoric such as, quote, after the war ended, US military started hiring many Ryukyuans, which means Okinawans, so the labor market for non-agricultural industry has drastically improved. Newly hired workers were not only paid well, but also they were given an opportunity to receive a vocational training to work in non-agricultural work. There's one special issue on labor condition of Okinawa. And then there's an article saying that US military is showing a great model of safety protection, labor security, vocational program, and so on. Although it's gradual, local companies are learning such working skills from the US military. In another article says, Okinawa used to be a mere small island that often gets omitted in the world map. However, it now stands as one of the most successful developing regions in the global development competition. While US military advertised such work as great opportunity for economic development, stories by former military workers reveal more nuanced aspect of the work. For example, a story of Yuna Makato, former military-based workers from Okinawa, reveals that many were widows, just like herself, started working for military to support their children. And then sometimes her children also joined her to earn extra money. We can see here that there was active participation of women and underage children in the US military-based work. And ultimately, they supported US military activities. She recalls in her interview that the advantage that she found in her job, which was a lawn mower, was that she was able to take home the firewood that she cut and Christmas gifts that she received from her American colleagues. Material gain had a symbolic power that impacted her working experience as a military-based worker. But it poses a question here that if there were any other improvement that she saw in herself, other than the material gains through working as a military-based worker, as long as her interview suggests the US government contention repeated in the magazine Shurei no Hikari that I shown earlier, that Okinawans are witnessing a great progress accomplished under the US occupation was actually the material gain that compensated her fundamental living life, such as the firewood. I can go on many more stories, but because of the time limit, I stop here. So as a conclusion, I argue that the US occupation of Okinawa led to the emergence of a surplus population, which was robbed of its land and its traditional work in agriculture, and that the local labor force was instead mobilized and utilized for US military operations. The successful expansion of US military installations came at the expense of local civilians whose indigenous lands were coercively expropriated in the course of Cold War geopolitical considerations. Moreover, it is important to emphasize that these activities were operated under the name of economic recovery for local Okinawans. Also, paying attention to the actual experience of local workers reveals a more complicated and an ambivalent situation. Those stories contradict and complicate what was described by the US administration, such as in the magazine Shurei no Hikari. Post-war Okinawa began with US occupation has brought modernization and industrialization to people's lives to some extent. Yet, emergence of military-based work symbolizes a complicated aspect of post-war development in Okinawa, where indigenous lands and the local labor power were employed to support Cold War geopolitical concerns. Thank you very much for listening, and any comments or question will be appreciated later.
Thank you so much, Aquino, for your extremely informative presentation.
It's a question for Aquino Oshiro-san. So I thank you, first of all of you, were great presentations. I really enjoyed it. And so first of all, it's so good that somebody has also a fair share of social history. So I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was just wondering, it's a bit of a random question, but in general, because there was so much migration from Okinawa already before the American occupation, so many families of Okinawan origin were living in Latin America, for instance, and also in the Micronesian islands and so on. So I was wondering, in this period between 45 and 72, I mean, you focused on the base military work, which was amazing and very important, of course. But I just wondered, so how important were the kind of socioeconomic relations of Okinawan families to their relatives who had migrated outside, either to the Japanese mainland, but also many, for instance, to Latin America or Micronesia. I guess from Micronesia, they were kicked out probably, but so was there kind of a significant transfer of money, for instance, or goods, or did their experiences coming back somehow interrelate with the kind of work life of these families then in post-Okinawa battle, American occupation Okinawa? So it's a bit of a random question, but I just wondered if in your research you stumbled upon instances where there was some kind of financing, also funding by family members who were living outside, or strong relations that had some socioeconomic impact with the Latin American Okinawan community, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, and that is very great question. I need to keep my notes on, but I'm not quite familiar with that kind of discourse found in my research, and then certainly I will keep my eyes on that. But I heard that there were some remittance, the money sent from the Kenke Jing in Hawaii after the war, and then I heard that it helped so much the socioeconomic situation in Okinawa today. So yeah, definitely I'll look into that instance as well. And then there are not only the people who already went outside of Okinawa, but they are what can I say? People who were lost their lands and an occupation, but they chose to migrate as well, not to work for the military bases. So maybe it's interesting to see and then compare those who stayed in Okinawa mainland and then those who migrated outside of Okinawa in the post-war development. Thank you.
Thank you. Yannick, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to ask a question to Miss Akino Ashiro. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I was just wondering, well, maybe it's also a bit outside of your scope, the scope of your research, but you were. My question was if you were mainly focusing on the on-base work of on the work on the military bases themselves, if I understand correctly. But have you also taken into consideration how the presence of those military bases has impacted like the labor in the industry in the vicinity of those bases? And then I'm mostly looking at the increase of like bars and cafes and really neighborhoods dedicated to bars and such that catered almost solely to U.S. military personnel, and how this maybe, and how large of a how large of a part is what this kind of work around the military bases also played in the development of like mostly the tertiary industry during the occupation periods.
Thank you so much for a comment, question. And there, yeah, that is very important aspect in my study too. Yeah, so geographically speaking, there are some studies which pay attention to especially female workers who work at the like bar or a drinking place, where the customers are mainly military personnel. But in my research, I want to pay attention what was happening in on the base, like you said. That is because according to some interviews of those former military base workers, it has been very difficult for them to talk about their experience, which was happening on the base, because during that time, apparently those workers who speak about experience or leak the information of what was happening on the base, some of them got fired by the U.S. military personnel. So they have this traumatizing memory of speaking about their working experience on the base. And then it's also they have a difficulty of letting this history out in the society, that the history of working for the base in the Okinawan society, because it's some extent it's stigmatized, and then they have family members who have a conflict on this matter. So the interview that I referred to in this research only came in 2013, And then journalists who interviewed them were saying that it was really difficult for him, the journalist, to get the permission to interview them. So that fact itself speaks the importance of focusing on those who worked on the base today. So that is why I chose to pay attention to those who work on the base in this my research.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Next, Teal, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for those very interesting presentations. I have 2.5 questions to 2 presenters. One is a question for clarification to Kuramitsu Kanako. You mentioned in your presentation how there were like official marriage relations between mostly Chinese women and Japanese soldiers, ex-soldiers. Where I wasn't really 100% convinced on your civilian category there, but whatever. What I wanted to ask you is how the marriages were registered, because you said something like they were registered with the Chinese government, and then my question would be, which government is that? So is that the so-called reformed government of Wang Jiwei, or where are they registered, and how do they later kind of use that for repatriation, for example, right? So using the Japanese controlled government, and then so on and so forth. So that's my first question, which government? And the second question goes to the 1.5 question goes to Akino Oshiro. And thank you for your interesting talk. And I found it very fascinating. I work on labor history and political history and 1968 in Japan, which of course touches Okinawa and the Ryukyus and so on and so forth. What I would like, I found it very interesting how you try to actually look at the development state, right? Military base work as construction sites, and it's very fascinating how many stories you can find there, looking at labor history. So my question goes, the first one is, you began with 1945, and what I would like to ask you if what are the continuities and discontinuities between Okinawa or the Ryukyu Islands under Japanese rule, I would say, because you emphasize that traditional farming is getting less and less important, and you know that traditional farming in Okinawa, the biggest amount of it is actually producing sugar canes, first for the Satsuma domain and later for Japan. So that is cash crop farming, right? Which is right in the dimension of an exploitation colony, so to say, right? And then we have a shift maybe that to something like a development state under American rule. Would you, how do you, so how would you frame that? That's my first question. And the other one is more of a comment. I was a little bit startled by your Battle of Okinawa example, right? So you had your argument that Japanese workers doing construction site-like work by getting rid of people who died in the Battle of Okinawa, if I understand correctly, because you told us that bullets were still flying, right? And don't you think that this is a little bit extreme example to argument for that the lives of Japanese or Okinawan workers are endangered there? I mean, because we are in a very, very extreme situation at the Battle of Okinawa with, these commanded suicides by citizens or civilians in Okinawa in the famous case, people jumping off cliffs, suicide attacks, many American soldiers dying there. So I'm a little bit not happy if that serves your argument about, how, when you want to say how the American occupation is using bodies of, for example, Ryukyuans for the development project or as labor force, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. So we've just reached the time, but me and Aquino tried to answer briefly, so thank you for your really good question about marriage. The laws, marriage laws in Japan and China during the war, they were different. And in China, as long as there were two witnesses and there was a ceremony that was carried out publicly, it was considered as an official marriage, and they didn't require registration. So there was no registration or certificate at the time. And in Japan, on the other hand, they required registration in the Koseki family register. And what was interesting was that the Japanese family court in the 1980s, they recognized the marriage that was not registered as long in China, as long as they collected testimonies from the wedding witnesses and those who were invited to the wedding. And also if there were testimonies from the mother and father, they could consider it as a valid official marriage. And based on that, these children could acquire Japanese nationality through the court. And also about this definition of children born of war, in the academic term right now, it only includes children born of foreign soldiers or occupation soldiers and UN soldiers. But in the case of the Sino-Japanese War, the labor mobility within wartime China was very fluid. And for example, the soldier who was discharged, some of them remained in China, became a civilian, and then was recruited in the army towards the end of the war. And so this shift from civilian to military personnel happened quite in a fluid way. And the situation of the post-World War II in Europe was quite different. That there were not so many civilians who came for business reasons or for the state-controlled companies. So this was the difference in the definition. Okay, thank you. So Aquino, would you like to answer the rest of the questions from Tiff?
Yes, thank you so much for all your very鋭いquestions. And yes, I think you're right. And then continuity is something that I should take into account, especially talking about the tradition. What is traditional farming methodology in Okinawa at that time? Because yeah, as you said, a sugarcane production and pineapple production has already started for the U.S. occupation. But there was a reinforcement of such agricultural production reinforced by the U.S. occupation. So maybe in that sense, I can see the continuity from pre-war to post-war. But like you said, yeah, development state, I think I need to think about it more. And then your second question is very, it's a difficult question. It might be an extreme example, but it was recorded in the testimonies and it did happen there. So it depends on how I deal with those testimonies in my research. And yeah, from a historical point of view, maybe it depends. I think I should think about more how to take care of those historical memories or historical examples in my study, and how to balance it with the social science methodological point of view, I guess. And I think if you have any advice, good advice, I would like to have your help me on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. We have reached the time. So thank you again, Akino and Elisa, for your inspirational presentations. And I would like to thank the audience for your interest and active participation in the Q&A. So I hope everyone continues to enjoy the conference until this Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you very much.